Hello, everybody. I did a mic check before, but can everyone hear me in the back okay? Does it sound good? Does it sound rich? All right. My name is Kyle Rankin. By day, I handle infrastructure and security for a credit card startup called Final. In my free time, I do a lot of technical writing, so I write a lot for Linux Journal, and I've written a number of books over the years, mostly on Linux and sysadmin type stuff, although more recently, a lot more on security. So I was so close to having a copy in my hand. I just came out with a new book, Linux Hardening and Hostile Networks, that a lot of this talk is based off of the first chapter in that book, where I elaborate in way more detail. But anyway, yeah, so that's sort of like what this talk was based off of and my background. So first thing to say, so this is a password track, right? And so there's some hardcore password crackers, maybe even in the audience, but definitely in the building. This talk is not about advanced password cracking. This talk is not aimed at advanced password crackers. This is a talk for general audiences, just about anybody. We're not getting into like hardcore technical details of that stuff. It's really more about sort of the history of password policy and the failure of password policy. So just to let you know ahead of time. So what is the talk going to be about? So here's the agenda. So brief introduction of it. I'm going to talk about RMS and the MIT password revolt, which may not be on front of everyone's mind as far as password history goes. Then I'm going to talk about sort of the golden age of computer passwords like you see in the movies. We'll talk about the .com boom and how that changed password policy now that everyone was on like a AD domain and how that changed password policy. Then I'll discuss sort of what I call the XKCD password renaissance. That started people thinking about passphrases. Then I'll dive a little bit, that'll be sort of the it for password policy, and I'll talk a little bit about some semi-modern approaches to cracking, sort of based in the rock UHack era. Talk about a couple of new more modern approaches for password policy, touch on 2FA as well, password reset attacks, and then a little conclusion, and take questions at the end. All right, so if you want to hack an account, you guessed the password. It's been the weakest link in security for decades now. Most people that are in security kind of recognize this. And a lot of people in security blame the users, but it's not the user's fault. It's very easy to blame them for a lot of problems, but this is not their fault. It's largely, in my opinion, the security industry's fault first. That's then been passed down to IT, who trusted the security team, who then pushed it out to the rest of the users. And the rest of this talk will sort of expound on that notion, but that's who I blame for it. The reason is the security researching industry, especially for the last couple of decades, up until recently, were focused mostly on theoretical attacks and other aspects, not just password policy. They still kind of focus on either theoretical attacks or hacker movie kinds of stuff, and largely ignore what real users will do with security. So as a result, we've been giving users decades of really bad password advice and policy, and then kind of be surprised when they follow our advice, and then have passwords that get cracked. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about, first, how do we get here? How do we get to the point that we have sort of the password mess that we have now based on these decades of bad policy? Then talk about what the current threats are against passwords today, more or less, and then talk about some things that we can do today that try to mitigate those. All right, so we normally think of, especially if you've been using computers relatively recently, you sort of assume it has a password. Everything has a password. This is a security conference. People think of computers having passwords, but computers didn't always have passwords. Not just because they were insecure, but passwords weren't always necessarily viewed as a good thing for a computer to have. And my favorite example of this is Richard Stallman, who, if you're familiar with free software and the free software movement and open source software, he's the founder of the GNU project and the Free Software Foundation. And a lot of the open source or free software that you use sort of can be traced back to his work. Well, he viewed passwords as a means of control, not a positive thing. Most people know about him from his open source work, his free software work, RMS, his free software work. But most people don't know that RMS is also a password cracker. So to tell the story, RMS joined the MIT AI lab in 1971, and he and the team were working on a computer system there. The system they built intentionally to not have passwords. And so here's what he had to say about that. We didn't have any passwords. The reason was that the hackers who'd originally designed the system realized that passwords were just a way the administrators could control all the users. So they just didn't do it. They left that out. So he sees it as a way of like top-down control over people. So at one point, this horrible thing happens where they put passwords. Some of the administrators start putting passwords on the system. So in his words, when they put passwords onto one of the machines at MIT, I didn't like it. So I figured out how to decode the passwords. So I sent messages to people on the network. This is back in the day, so this is probably using Finger and things like that. Hello, I see that you've chosen the password Mumble. How about, or whatever the password was. How about if you just type enter for a password? It's much shorter. And so he was both letting them in on the fact that the security was worthless as far as how they were storing passwords there, and also trying to subvert the authoritarian control of passwords on the system by getting them to just have enter. Also, the system accepted enter as a valid password. So that leads us into the golden age of computer passwords. So in the beginning, a lot of people treated computer passwords like traditional passwords, like the kind of thing you would do if you wanted to get into a speakeasy or things like that. So they were generally like single words because many computers actually didn't support passwords longer than 8 characters. Even computers that claimed to accept passwords longer than 8 characters, and some semi-modern systems actually will truncate it after you type 8 characters. So you may think that you've pasted in this crazy password, and it just cuts it off. It's fine. Also, some computers ignored case. So lowercase password, uppercase password, it's all the same to it. So it doesn't really matter. You can mix case all day long, and it treats it as the same thing. So as a result of this, most passwords were single words. They were generally something based on a dictionary, and they were simple. They were easy to guess. Also, people, when you ask them to pick a password, people tended to sort of gravitate around the same passwords for things. And so there's certain passwords that were very commonly used. So this resulted in hackers having this sort of inbound knowledge, it's sort of like this domain knowledge that was passed around of commonly used passwords. So for example, popular passwords were things like love, sex, secret, and of course God. And this was sort of like the hidden handshake. If you were a hacker, what you would study and memorize were all of the commonly used passwords that everyone picked, and when you were cracking somebody, you would try those. And of course, password has always, it's been a classic password from the beginning. So if you want to hack somebody, one way to do it is just to try every word in the dictionary, and you'll eventually get in. But if that's too slow, what you would do is you would just guess words that were important to them. So those things might be spouse names, children, pets, sports teams, things like that. And this is also the main way that people got hacked in movies. So for instance, if you wanted to break into the Seattle school district, the password was pencil, which makes sense because it's a school, If you wanted to break into the DoD system responsible for wargaming, the password was Joshua, because that was the name of the son of the main engineer of the system. If you wanted to break into the Gibson, you just type God, because that's one of the common passwords. So that's sort of the classic era. But around that time, you started getting tools like John the Ripper that automated the process of password cracking. And as computers got faster, so did dictionary attacks. So these password policies that were just based on allowing single words didn't really work very well. As a result, IT departments started responding with password policies, not allowing what they would consider weak passwords to be added to the system. This was also sort of comes around the era of centralized Windows administration that made this a lot easier. If every single system had its own unique password, every computer that someone would need to log into, maintaining a global policy across all those computers was challenging. But this is the era of Novell NetWare, Banyan Vines. Any Banyan Vines people in the house? Yeah? Okay, that's okay. Or more popularly, Active Directory, right? And that allowed IT administrators to get a list of what were approved password policies that security experts said would create a secure password and enforce that across every computer across the board. And most of the advances in password policy corresponded with advances in Active Directory features or other features for central administration. these policies were well-meaning. I mean, the goal was to protect the user from picking a password that someone could guess, but they were misguided. And users generally hated them, and users still generally hate password policies. If you talk to anyone who works for a decently sized corporation and ask them about how do they feel about the password policy, you'll get an earful. And you should, because they're usually awful. So here's some examples. Minimum password length. So the policy would be something like passwords must be at least 6 characters. The reason is that would make a dictionary attack take longer than, say, a 4-character password, right? So you have to at least have 6 characters in theory. Because the theoretical combination is between 1 and 300 million combinations. So on paper, the math tells us that if 1 million if you allow only numbers, if you allow like alpha in characters, it goes up to 300 million. That sounds like a lot of combinations. But what did users do? So they picked QWERTY, they picked secret, they picked password, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Totally fit the policy. What did attackers do? They took their dictionary and removed all of the words that were shorter than 6 characters and tried the rest, and they got in. So now we had a response to that, which was password complexity rules. So new policy on top of the existing one is now passwords also must contain at least 1 uppercase letter. The reason is that increases the total number of password combinations, and it removes passwords that are just numbers. So now we get up to potentially 19 billion combinations. So what did users do? They picked QWERTY with an uppercase Q, secret with an uppercase S, and password with an uppercase P, right? Totally fit the policy. Attackers, they took their dictionary and they uppercased the first letter of every word in the dictionary and tried that, and they got in. So IT responded with more password complexity rules. So now the password must contain at least 1 uppercase letter O and 1 number, too. Because, again, it increases the total number of combinations. If you do the math, you're really making it hard for hackers, because brute forcing that, we're talking 57 billion combinations. No way they're going to get in, right? On paper, it's like atoms. You start talking about atoms in the universe, right? So users pick QWERTY and they put a 1 at the end, secret and they put a 1 at the end, and password with a 1 at the end. I like to refer to this as is the password mullet, because it's uppercase in the front and a number in the back. So what did attackers do? They added 0 through 9 to the end of all of their dictionary words, and then ran through the dictionary and cracked all the passwords. So now even more complexity. So OK, that's not going to work. So now the new policy is now the password must contain at least 1 uppercase letter and 2 numbers. Why? Well, because people were just adding a number to the end. So if we make them add 2 numbers to the password, then that increases the complexity. They're more likely to put it somewhere else. Again, the theoretical combinations are still 57 billion. We're not increasing the minimum character length, but we're saying you have to have at least 2 numbers to protect against just adding a number at the end. So users picked QWERTY 84, secret 69, and password 11. So what attackers would do is they went to the dictionary words, added 2 digits to the end of the dictionary words. And in particular, if you wanted to be faster, if you knew something about the person, you would pick significant dates from their life, because usually 2 digits map pretty well to years. So like, when were they born, when did they graduate high school, college, when are their kids born, things like that. We didn't stop there. So now, OK, fine. So now we're going to use math to save us. So passwords must contain at least 1 upper, 1 number, and a symbol. Why? Because it adds an order of magnitude to the entropy. And also stops users from just adding numbers to the end, because now they have to throw a symbol somewhere in there really strange, right? The theoretical combinations now jump from 57 billion to 782 billion. Again, you start talking to people in this era about this policy, and they start talking about every atom in the universe being a computer that can crank through this many passwords and how impossible brute forcing this is. So the users picked QWERTY 84 bang, secret 69 bang, and password 11 bang, right? And attackers added a few symbols to the end. You sort of get where I'm going here. So this also led to another interesting phenomenon, specifically among IT people and hackers, which was the leet speak. So the problem with these complex passwords that everyone now had to do was that they were really hard to remember. So IT people were like, well, I know a clever way to make a memorable password. What I will do is I will take a dictionary word and apply leet speak to it, and boom, instant password that passes all the complexity requirements. I can remember it, but no one will ever guess it. Every IT person did this, and every IT person also advised everybody underneath them and every user that they were representing, this is how you pick a safe, secure password. So for example, if you're not familiar with LeetSpeak, password lowercase becomes password like that with that sort of transformation. There's some variations on that. So if you need symbols, for instance, it would always be this instead. So this was an actual admin password at a job I had before. Just full disclosure, that's how prevalent this was. So it turns out attackers also know how to speak LeetSpeak. Yeah, it's weird. And it turns out computers are really good at applying formulaic transformations to words, even though you have to use regular expressions to do that. They're really good at doing that. So they did. All right, so that's fine. Now we have the showstopper that's going to stop everyone in their tracks, which is password rotation, which everyone loves password rotation. So the policy is now passwords must be changed every 3 months, right? Why? Well, we need a couple reasons. One, we need to limit the time it takes to crack the password before the password changes. So for example, if you say, yeah, a really sophisticated attacker might be able to crack that in 6 months. So we'll just change it every 3 months. So then by the time they're halfway through cracking it, boom, new password, done. No way. The other reason was there's this idea that if a hacker somehow got into your system, you would, at some point in that 3-month window, change the password out from under them, and they would just be completely locked out of the system. And there's no way they could get back in, right? Those are the two, if you ask people about password rotation, those are the two main reasons they'll give you. So users would pick password 1 bang, and then the next month, or the next 3 months, they would pick password 2 bang and password 3 bang. What attackers would do is they would guess one of the weak passwords, and once they guessed one, they would know what your scheme is. And once they know your scheme, they would be able to apply that to guess what your future password was. The other thing they would do is, usually when someone attacks an account, one of the first things they do is put a backdoor in so they don't have to get in through the normal way. So that doesn't really help with that. But there's a study that I actually linked to at the end of the talk. This is a number of years old. It's over a decade old now. But there's I forget the school now, but they did a study where they were able to capture all of the passwords that people selected that had a password rotation requirement. And they were able to accurately guess the next password with about 70% accuracy if they knew 1 or 2 of the previous passwords. So as you might guess, there's some problems with these policies, right? So essentially, it's bad for everyone except for hackers. The first, and this is one that doesn't get talked about a whole lot, it wastes a whole lot of IT time troubleshooting account lockouts. So at one job, I sat across from the Windows help desk team. And you always knew when it was password expiry day because you would get there maybe before some of the help desk people, and there would already be someone standing there at the desk who was locked out of their Windows domain, and they couldn't work, right? And the entire next day or two would be help desk folks having to go through and unlock accounts. So a huge burden on IT. It also frustrates users who pick what otherwise would legitimately be considered a hard password that then gets rejected. Imagine you're trying really hard to pick what you think is a good password, and they're like, nope, no good. Like, okay, I'll try one more time. That's no good either. Okay, forget it. Password 2 bang. The other thing is, the more complex your password is, the more painful it is to rotate. If you come up with an actually legitimate, difficult password to memorize, like all these passwords are hard to remember, but you do it, and you finally get the muscle memory going. And after a month or so, it's not so bad. But that's too bad because now you have to rotate it again. So after about twice at best, most people aren't going to go to the trouble of picking a really complicated password, even if they had all the best intentions at first, because it's just too much. It makes it too difficult. You're encouraging users toward bad passwords. And of course, this always led to passwords on Post-it notes. Everyone, again, dumb users putting passwords on Post-it. It's not the user's fault. They did that because this policy is ridiculous, and it encouraged users to have to do things like this to work. In general, these policies encourage users to pick the weakest possible password that still met the standard. So they would do all of these little tricks where in like Windows AD domains where they would check for a certain percentage of characters in the previous password. Every little example I gave, they would come up with like a short-sighted countermeasure for. But in the end, all the same, every new countermeasure they would come up with still encourage users to pick weak passwords. Pick the weakest password that you can that still fits the standard. In the end, almost everyone's password ends up being a dictionary word and some kind of transformation. And hackers are still able to guess the majority of what are otherwise so-called complex passwords because computers can take a dictionary word and add complex transformations to it. They're very good at doing that. All right, so then we get the XKCD password renaissance. Hopefully, many of you are familiar with the correct horse battery staple, the famous correct horse. This and Bobby Tables seem to be the two XKCD comics that get the most. These are the kinds that get pinned on the cubicle back when. Remember cubicles, by the way? Back when there were cubicles. So this comic, I mean, you could say maybe this was a response culturally to some groundswell of opinion about password policy and passphrases, or you could say that this comic started it. But either way, it doesn't really matter because people started shifting away from the notion of password complexity and theoretical mathematical difficulty and brute forcing and started thinking about long passphrases and started thinking a little bit about the user. So for example, this is my current personal corporate password policy. 12-character minimum, no rotation, no complexity. That's it. Easy for everyone to remember, easy to implement. The theoretical combinations are 95 quadrillion. So compared to that, I think it was 580-some billion for your traditional kind of other complex password. Even if you compare this to the 8-character mixed case number symbols that most people think is a decent password policy from the old school, that's 7.2 quadrillion combinations. So we have more combinations, but it generates a better quality password. So by not rotating the password, we're encouraging people to pick even longer than 12-character passwords. We're encouraging them to pick complex passwords, passwords that may be a little bit difficult for them at first to remember. But for example, sometimes I will encourage people, and we're going to talk about a footnote to this comment here in another slide, but sometimes I would recommend pick a long movie quote or a song lyric, things like that, because everyone says, well, I can't remember these things, but there's at least, everyone knows some part of Don't Stop Believin', and there's like all these other songs that you know the lyrics to, or quotes from your favorite movie or whatever. So people can remember long strings of text. Or if you're concerned about some of the attacks against that, you can also use DiceWare, which, by the way, feels modern, but it was created in 1995. So it's been around for a long time, like that notion. And so the idea behind DiceWare is it makes it easy for you. You have this dictionary of pre-approved words that have a number assigned to them, and you use a series of die rolls to pick different words, and you pick, say, 5 or 6 words that are randomly generated, essentially, that form your passphrase. The thing is, this seems burdensome at first, but muscle memory takes over pretty quickly. And again, we're going to talk about some other things like password managers later, but this is for, there's always a couple of passwords that you have to memorize, you can't put in a password manager. The fact is, after you do this a couple of times, whatever your password is, there's a lot of passwords I have now that I couldn't tell you what they are. I just know how they feel and whether they feel right, So if you touch type, you sort of getting into this mode where muscle memory takes over and you type your password. But, I'm just some guy, so if you go to your IT department and say, hey, this guy just said that your password policy sucks and it's wrong and insecure and you need to change it, they're going to be like, yeah, but I have this security bulletin from 2002 that tells me about how passwords need to be complex, right? But you don't have to take my word for it. So the new NIST guidelines also discourage password rotation, complex passwords, and they encourage passphrases. So this is like as official as it's going to get for something that you can show them. So here's the perfect paragraph from this. So verifiers should not impose other composition rules like mixtures of different character types, so no complexity. On memorized secrets, verifiers should not require memorized secrets to be changed arbitrarily. So boom, no password complexity. Boom, no rotation. So print that out, take that back to your IT department. It's hyperlinked in there. So there's no excuse for them to not change it now because this is like government documentation kind of, it's super official. All right. So let's talk a little bit about, we talked about policy. Let's talk about some of the current attacks against passwords. Modern password cracking, especially if you've gone to other talks in this track, you'll know these very advanced, sophisticated tools. DEF CON is a sporting event just devoted to doing that, right? Like people do it for fun, not just for gain. So people hone their skills to be very good at this. Not all, but most password cracking ends up starting with some sort of hashed password database dump. So it's one-way hashed, so they have to do some attempt at guessing or brute force to crack these passwords. This allows a cracker to brute force offline, so they don't have to sit there and hammer a server that kind of, when you do thousands of comparisons a second on someone's live server, they might notice. But offline, you can just crank away at it. Also, tools like Hashcat support a variety of different hashing algorithms, and you can point huge dictionaries at them. They also support transformation patterns, so you can say, take my huge dictionaries of all these different known passwords and apply leet speak to them, or take them all and also just make the last two characters digits too. And it makes it very easy to convert good dictionaries into all these other transformations. And as a result, you dramatically reduce the actual the total combinations you need to brute force. Or at least you catch the easy to catch things first. So because of all of this, you can crack what are otherwise would be considered super complex passwords way faster than you think that you would because of all of these different steps to optimize. And in fact, OCL Hashcat also can use GPU for acceleration. So, back in the day, so for example, in 2012, I bought a graphic. I wrote a series of articles for a Linux journal then on building a password cracking rig. And so I invested in what at the time was a decent Bitcoin mining GPU. Not great, but not too expensive either. Remember back when you could use GPUs to get Bitcoins. So this was in 2012 for 280 bucks. I got a Radeon 6950, and I could do 350,000 MD5 comparisons a second. That's 2012. Obviously, people can do way more now with stacking a lot of different GPUs and things like that. There's the whole state of the art for that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the RockU hack. The unfortunate fact is most people reuse passwords across sites. They have a password or two passwords, maybe three passwords that they remember. Some people will say, I have my insecure password that I use for everything. Then I have my banking password that's slightly better that I use for all my, they have stuff like that, right? It's a common thing. What happens is when a hacker cracks a password on one site, the next thing they do, because they usually have both the password and an email address for contact, they will attempt that user name and password across a bunch of other popular sites to see if the user used the same username, which they often do, and use the same password, which they often do. If the attacker can get access to an email account, then they trigger a password reset, and by doing that, they can get all the remaining accounts that they couldn't get any other way in case the user didn't reuse the password. So back in 2009, the company RockU was hacked. And it exposed, during that hack, they dumped a database, and they were able to get access to 32 million user accounts. The interesting thing about this versus previous hacks where people had dumped password databases was all the passwords were in plain text. There wasn't even MD5 hashing. So this provided this treasure trove and this great insight into, as of 2009, what the most popular passwords were, what all the passwords, at least for these accounts, that people would use, even very complex passwords, right, because they weren't hashed. So it gave everyone who wanted to do password cracking this great current view into popular passwords. And immediately, everyone added this password dictionary to the dictionary. If you get a password cracker today, that's one of the common ones that comes along for the ride, and rightly so, because it's still in use. So slightly more advanced cracking. So as we have more password dumps, like people use the RockU password dump to then apply that to other hashed databases that they're having trouble cracking, and they're able to crack more and more passwords with that, which then led to more and more passwords being cracked from that password database, and it goes on with every site that gets a database dump. People start trying to get, you must crack them all. So people aren't satisfied with 90% success rate. They want all of them. And as you do that, you start devoting resources. You start building these dictionaries of what would otherwise be pretty difficult to guess passwords. Also, computers get faster, GPUs get faster, and cracking gets more optimized. So we're able to crack better and faster. Also, there's more exotic dictionaries that every year are being added. So for example, one of my favorites in this is, again, years ago now, but 2013, there's this great Ars Technica article about crackers using the Bible, Wikipedia, and YouTube comments for dictionaries. And by doing that, they were able to crack this database. They weren't satisfied with getting just like 75%, 85% of the hashes cracked. They wanted all of them. And so what better way to get phrases than the entire Bible and Wikipedia, which is there's a lot of text on there, a lot of passphrases and lyrics and things like that. And so for example, they were able to crack passwords like give me liberty or give me death, or in the beginning was the word, which were things that before you would say, well, that's a pretty solid password, long password, but memorable, and these are the kind of things that we advise. But there are now crackers who are able to add things like this to the dictionary. So this showed that passphrases, if you have a passphrase and there's a chance it might exist on a major internet site, it might be at risk. So then what do you do, right? So what's a good password? A really good password is one that you can't remember, unfortunately, right? Very long, so 20 plus characters, actually truly random and complex, even though we railed against complexity, right, before. That all those numbers of difficulty actually count if it's truly random, by the way. Also, do that and also use a new password for every single account. Problem is, this is really difficult, right? It's really hard to remember a really complex password, if not impossible. So this is where password managers come in. So for example, something like KeePassX, there's a lot of other cloud-based ones that you can do research on, but KeePassX is open source, it's local, it has an encrypted password database locally, it has a handy little generator, because every site can't come to an agreement about what good password policy is, and they have different weakness and strength indicators, and so you'll generate a password for one, you'll generate it randomly, paste it in, and it'll reject it for some dumb reason. So this includes a handy generator that you can tweak your policy to match their policy. This is good for all of those passwords that, for most of your passwords, because most of your passwords don't really need to be memorable if you have a password manager. But unfortunately, some passwords still need to be memorable, like the one you use to open your password manager. Disk encryption, logging into your workstation at work, right? There's a couple of passwords that you have to commit to memory. How strong should those be? Well, that sort of depends on the threat. I still hold that 12 character plus passphrase with no complexity is decent for your average level of threat, your average user. If you have a more advanced threat, then maybe something like a 5 or 6 word dice word password. Or if you need to pick a passphrase, pick one that doesn't exist on the internet. Just think about, does this phrase exist on the internet? And then don't search for it to see if it exists on the internet, because now it's on the internet, right? If you speak multiple languages and programming languages count, why don't you mix and match? Nothing says that your passphrase has to all be words from one language, right? All right, so let's talk about 2FA, because password cracking is one thing, but there's other lines of defense that can help protect you against having your password guessed. So there's 3 main categories of authentication. So something you know, something you have, and something you are. So passwords are a prime example of something that you know. It's in your head, and you spit it out. The best insurance against password cracking, in my opinion, is 2-factor authentication, 2FA. So what this means, if you're not familiar with this, is in addition to the password, you need to provide some extra factor, ideally from a different category than the first factor. So if the first factor is a password, ideally your second factor isn't also something you know. So for example, something you have might be keys, a token of some kind, your phone. Something you are biometrics, fingerprint, face, your signature, things like that. Once attacker, the great thing about this is once an attacker guesses your password, they also have to compromise your 2FA device. So that just adds this extra layer of defense, even if somehow they're able to get through the first one. So these days, most 2FA implementations use some kind of form of what fits into something you have category. And here's a couple of examples. So one of the most basic is SMS. So the way this works is you log into a site with your password, and then they will send you a text message that has some random multi-digit code. You type that code back in, and that proves that you have the phone that has that phone number. Of the choices that I'm going to list, it's considered the weakest choice because some attackers are being able recently to be able to intercept SMS. In some cases, they do it by by talking to your phone company and convincing them that they're you and you lost your phone. Could you please switch over to this phone? And they will happily do that sometimes. Otherwise, there's some flaws in the SS7 protocol that people are exploiting to be able to get SMS messages en masse. There's been a whole lot of hand-wringing over SMS and how dare you use SMS for two-factor auth. But honestly, it's still better than not having any two-factor auth. So if you're completely dissing SMS for two-factor auth because of those threats, which while they do exist, they're still so far relatively rare, it still requires the attacker to do this extra thing after they've cracked the password. So it's still better than nothing. Another option is push notifications to a phone. The way that this usually works is you have some sort of app that's usually linked to the company or the account that you're using. They usually have a corresponding app because every website has an app, right? You can't even browse a website on your phone without getting an invitation to install the app. Well, sometimes these apps can send a push notification to your phone. There's also 2FA providers, like say Duo is a prime example of this, that can optionally send a push notification to your phone. This is nice because it's convenient. So instead of having to look at my phone and look up and then type in numbers and get it wrong or not do it fast enough and then it rotates or whatever, you just say accept, and it's really convenient. So for example, I use this for some accounts because when I log in for work for the day, I end up, because of multiple environments, having 6 different 2FA authentications that need to happen if I want to work in these multiple environments because they all have different accounts. Typing in 6 numbers, one after the other, into all these different things would be horrible. With push notifications, it's just kind of horrible because it's a lot of 2FA. But it's still convenient. Oh, the other thing about this, before I move on, is the downside to this is that it's relying on the security of your phone. So you hack your phone, you're done. It also relies on the strength of the app. So if the app is insecure or has a vulnerability, then you could potentially intercept push notifications. So the next level up would be TLTP. This is time-based one-time pad. The idea behind this is you generate this multi-digit code on your phone that rotates every 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, it gets a new code. There's a lot of implementations of this. It's a way more secure approach because it relies on the shared secret that's between the server that's storing your password anyway, and either a hardware token that you have or some sort of software token, basically like an app on your phone. But when you're logging in, there's no communication going back and forth between the server that could be intercepted. You don't actually have to have, if you use a phone, it doesn't have to be on the internet for this to work. It just relies on the time. And then finally, there's U2F. It uses a key that's inside of a hardware token to respond to a challenge from the server. So the way that this works, you log in, it says insert your token. Usually, if it's USB, you plug in the USB device, you hit a button, and then it accepts a challenge from the server, and you log in. It's simple. It's very secure. The main downside to this is it's not very widely supported yet. And it does require that you buy a device, but it's a $20 device. So for some people, that's not a big deal, and for other people, that might be a lot. But in the past, those types of devices were way more expensive. They've come down more recently. And in some conferences, they hand them out like candy now sometimes. All right, so last thing to talk about before the conclusion is password reset attacks. So passwords aren't always the weakest link to get into an account. Sometimes it's a lot easier just to attack the account via the password reset. So the way that this works is an attacker gets access to your email, then they go to whatever account they want, they trigger the password reset, they get emailed some sort of either a new password or a link to click on, or there's a lot of different implementations. 2FA helps with this, but if you have access to the email, an attacker could potentially socially engineer a way around that. Talk to the organization, say, hey, I lost my phone, could you please disable 2FA? If they can convince them to disable 2FA, then they're in. Another option is Facebook is offering a new service called Delegated Account Recovery, where essentially what you do is instead of using email, you can use your Facebook account. They've built a new protocol around this that could allow you to use your trusted Facebook account instead of email to do password resets. It's a brand new protocol, and it's still in a closed beta right now. And basically what this comes down to is if you don't necessarily trust the security team behind your email, but you trust Facebook's security team more than that, then this gives you an option to do that, right? So in conclusion, so strong authentication is actually possible today. It's not hand-wringing, passwords are dead and all of this stuff. It's possible to have strong authentication. The only problem is InfoSec can't still agree on what it looks like. If you ask a couple different people, they will tell you a couple of different things about what they think strong authentication is. And this is not just for password policy, but for all of InfoSec. We still repeat all of these same mistakes that led to this decades of bad password policy. Here's the thing. Attackers, from the very beginning, have focused on real users and learned from real users. They use real users as their data source to understand what to do to attack. It's time for defenders to do the same thing. You didn't have to tell an attacker what a user would guess for a password based on a certain policy. They already knew. They could already guess because they spent time studying users and understanding what users would do. And again, defenders need to do the same thing if they want to build adequate defenses. Researchers need to shift focus away from hacker movies, as fun as that is. It's also easier, honestly, and you get both this thrill of it being exciting, but then in the back of your mind, you also know that it's a lot easier problem to solve than solving security for real users that are really using the system. IT also, again, bears some of the blame because they get these policies handed down, and it's a lot easier if you have a checkbox of do you do this, to just say yes, 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 oh, I don't do that yet, let's just do it, so I can check the box. It's a lot easier to do that. I know because I work for a credit card company, and we do PCI audits, right? There's a lot of checkboxes. It takes a lot of energy and a lot of knowledge to push back against one of those policies if you think that it's not good for if it's not good for your users, if you think it's a less secure practice. In general, they should be empowered and educated to be able to question what are so-called best practices. In general, but for this to work, it requires better security education across the board. It doesn't do, people in IT won't be able to question security practices if they don't have a decent background in security, or they won't feel qualified to question it or to speak up. So it's beneficial for everyone to have a decent education around this. And then finally, just stop blaming users for security problems that it's not their fault. All right, so questions. The talk is right there in that URL. It's live. You can go get the links. A lot of this, like I said, I cover in detail in the first chapter of Linux hardening and hostile networks. And then all these different the NIST guidelines and other links there. So right there in the front.
So I'm Jeffrey Goldberg from Agile Bits. I'll argue with you about the usefulness of 2FA at some later time because that would go on for hours.
Okay.
So I'm Jeffrey Goldberg from Agile Bits. I just wanted to add a historical point if Arnold is here. You mentioned both Diceware and XKCD. They are historically linked. The XKCD picked that up from actually a blog post that I wrote 3 weeks before the XKCD comic came out, in which I described Diceware.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I can give you that bit of history. And then just one minor correction. TOTP is time-based one-time password, not pad. Okay.
I've heard it said both, but okay.
Anyway,
fair enough.
Just a minor correction.
So I know the talk was mainly around how to generate good passwords. What about a future where we don't have passwords? Do you have any comments on ways that we can try to get rid of passwords using the other types that you mentioned, things that are on our person, TOTP, and other combinations of security techniques to remove the need for passwords at all?
Sure. So just in the time we have here, the only thing I could really elaborate on is a couple that I don't like. I'm not a big fan of biometrics for single-factor authentication, right? There's value in biometrics for single-factor authentication when the alternative is no authentication, right? So if you say, I will either use that for my lock screen or I won't have a lock screen, fine. Makes sense. There's certain use cases where it totally makes sense. But I don't think for people where that's not the only option, where they're choosing between that and a passcode or that and a password, I think in general, biometrics are a great third factor. In some cases, can be a decent second factor. I'm just not a fan for single factor.
So biometrics, I consider you're using.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on magic links? Some services like eBay, Slack, I believe, and others nowadays have these magic links that you go to the login page, you click a button, then you get an email, and within that email there is a link you click on, and then you're logged in automatically in your account. So what are your thoughts on that versus using a username password-based type of login?
Sure. It's so weird because I remember long ago we would tell people to inspect URLs, right, and train. Like one of the parts of user training was to look at the URL and make sure that it's a site, a domain name that you recognize, and things like that. And then now we have Twitter, and so those are way too long. So you have to have the domains be super short, right? And so we've taught people that every link you click, it's reasonable for it to go through 5 levels of redirection. And also it's reasonable for a website to pull content from 7 different domains. So I don't know yet how to give an end user good advice on how and whether to trust that kind of thing, I guess.
I kind of know my stand on this, and I don't really like CAPTCHAs and the where you said click that you're not a robo person. But do you think there might be something in the future that we could probably do to not have those kind of CAPTCHAs, just for the website to know that you are a person?
I think those. Oh, I can say that something's dead. Okay, so those are dead. And the reason they're dead is if we actually believe all of the hype that we're seeing about artificial intelligence, and we spend all day training all of these bots, in particular for image recognition and stuff, what we're sort of saying is we think that we can create a world where we can create a machine that can impersonate a human, right? And pass a Turing test and all that stuff. So I think it's going to be harder and harder. I think most of those tests now are really useful for people that are building AI, because it helps train them against the things that they think machines might not be good at. But again, that becomes this big arms race, right? Where I think eventually we'll get to a point where it'll be really hard unless you ask someone about. Well, the only example where that's not dead is if you were to take a website and it asks you, let's say that you're sitting in a desert and you come across a turtle, and the turtle's lying on its back in the hot sun, and the hot sun is baking its stomach, and does that bother you? That's a Blade Runner reference, and I'm sorry for doing a reference. But apart from Replica, even that didn't work out so well for them, right? And so, yeah, so anyway, I think CAPTCHAs are dead.
So I noticed that you talked about 2FA and like U2F, and that this effectively solves our problem that we don't trust the phone because we have this hardened token that we can trust because the phone we can't trust because the phone has software. This hardened token we can trust because it's hardware, and hardware is eminently trustable. But hardware isn't really eminently trustable. We just have no real means of verifying that this hardware is trustable. And we've effectively just, when we put our trust into like hardware tokens that people hand out like candy at conferences, we're just pushing the problem into a realm that we can't inspect.
So I wouldn't go as far to say that 2FA solves authentication at all. No, far be it. All it does is add an extra layer of security to deal with the problem of a password potentially being guessable by some state of the art. It adds this extra layer. I mean, for every 2FA implementation, you can conceive of attacks against it. But all that said, you still the result that you end up with is still stronger security for most users. And so it's still worth doing, even if you can conceive of a world of untrustworthy hardware. It's still way better than what the alternative is right now, which is a single factor that's a passphrase or something.
In your talk, you cited NIST and said, password complexity and whatever. But then later you said SMS was okay. That contradicts NIST's stance on it. I was wondering why.
Yeah. So I still hold, like I said, there's a lot of talk right now about SMS is dead, right? And so to me, again, it comes down to my rather nuanced opinion about biometrics. If you ask me from a security context what I feel about biometrics, a short soundbite would be I don't really like it for authentication because of 7 different reasons. But there are certain circumstances where when you compare it to the alternative, it's better. And in the case of SMS 2FA, it's still better than the alternative of not having. So there's a lot of people that don't necessarily have a smartphone or don't necessarily have a hardware token or things like that, but they do have a cell phone that can accept SMS, and it's still more secure for them to have a 2FA option than to just have their password. Yeah.
Hey, Kyle.
Hey.
Quick question for you. How do you feel about like the browser password managers, like Google will remember your passwords for websites and that sort of thing? Safe, not safe-ish?
Yeah, browser password managers. I can, like you mean built into the browser or the ones that sort of use like JavaScript, maybe everything uses JavaScript, but like, or you mean like the cloud-based ones, or do you mean ones built into like Firefox?
Yeah, like so they'll say, like Google will be like, do you want us to remember this password for you? Or I guess Firefox does the same thing. So when you're typing your creds into a website, so you don't have to type them in next time you go to that website?
Yeah, it's better than nothing, but it's not as strong as some of the alternative password managers. So if you're going to go full bore into, I'm going to use a password manager, and you should, the alternatives, I think, are stronger from a security standpoint. I lean more toward local password manager databases myself, because I know where they are and everything. I know they're not going to be monetized and things later, but yeah.
So yeah, I subscribe to the same thread of longer wins every time, complete random so you don't have to memorize them, and better that you don't. And I love password managers. But my thought on password managers, the only critique I have is because you can't memorize them and they're so long, you have to copy them to the clipboard. And so that's where the vulnerability lies, I think. Like LastPass does a really good job of, like Tavis came out with that, exploit or that vulnerability that he found, and they came out with a fix within 3 hours or something like that. And that's great. I love that they're proactive on that. But the clipboard is vulnerable in this sense. On your average workstation, for sure.
But for example, if there's a distribution of Linux called Cubes that allows you to segregate your workflows into a lot of different VMs, and they have what's the notion of this global clipboard, and then clipboards for each VM. They do it in a pretty clever way, but anyway, the long and the short of it is it allows you to copy and paste from a trusted VM that kind of acts as a poor man's hardware security module into a less trusted VM without other VMs that are running on the same machine being able to intercept the clipboard.
Sure, but anyway, is the average user going to do that?
Totally not, and they probably shouldn't. No, Cubes is, this is running on Cubes. This laptop's using it, and I love it, but no, it's not for your average user at all. I've been a Linux user for a long time, so I expect a lot of abuse and things to be difficult, and just sort of embrace it. But a lot of people don't. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that the way that the better password managers work is that they do not use the clipboard. They've got other sorts of inter-process communication within their own browser extension. So, in a sense, using a password manager that provides its browser integration gets you around the clipboard problem.
So I think I'm just going to cut it off, and so because we can have people set up. So thanks everybody for coming. I would love to talk to you, but more like I'll be up here or out there, and just grab me in the hallways if you have any other questions. Thanks.